Good day. Today, Sunday 12th November, the two great crises that have been dominating events this autumn, the conflict in Gaza and the conflict in Ukraine, remain as intense as always. In fact, my own sense is that the conflict in Gaza, the wider conflict in the Middle East of which it is a part, is in some ways actually intensifying, at any rate in terms of its political effect. So where are we? Well, briefly, it seems that the fighting in Gaza has now come to center on a battle for control of the Al-Shifa hospital. I say that, I'm not entirely clear whether this is exactly how the Israelis would describe the current fighting, but it is certainly what more and more people are starting to think. There's been a stream of reports from the Al-Shifa hospital itself, speaking of disastrous conditions for the staff and patients there. There have been strong words about the condition of the Al-Shifa hospital from international agencies, including, I understand, the Red Cross. There's been much criticism of Israeli actions around the world about what appears to be, or what most of the world perceives to be, a siege of the hospital. There was a huge protest yesterday in London. According to the Metropolitan Police, 300,000 people attended. This is, I believe, the third in a series of rolling protests that have been taking place in London. It was every weekend, though it was significantly larger than the previous ones, and I believe that it is the biggest protest that has taken place in London since the huge protest that took place on the eve of the 2003 Iraq War. So, over the course of that protest, speakers at the protest in London again brought up what was happening at the Al-Shifa hospital, and there was much emotional talk, understandably emotional talk, about what is happening at the Al-Shifa hospital. Now, as I said, I'm not entirely clear what Israel's own claims about what is happening at the Al-Shifa hospital exactly are, but it does seem to me as if this is the focus of the fighting at the moment. And of course, Israel, the Israeli authorities have in the past, and I understand still, claimed that the Al-Shifa hospital is located above a gigantic bunker complex deep into the earth from which supposedly Hamas coordinates its activities, and that the Al-Shifa hospital is in effect some kind of a human shield protecting Hamas, or protecting these Hamas operatives who are conducting their operations underground, deep underground from these bunkers. And Israeli officials have on occasion spoken about the need for the hospital staff and patients in the Al-Shifa hospital to evacuate the hospital, even as these military operations continue. And the staff at the hospital say that this is impossible. It would mean abandoning patients to their fate. Not all of the patients can be removed, at least certainly not in the current conditions, and they will, despite the enormous danger to themselves, remain where they are. So, a battle, or so it seems, for control of a hospital. It would be difficult to imagine a more politically damaging battle for Israel than a battle like this. And as I have discussed on numerous occasions, even if Hamas does have a gigantic bunker complex beneath this hospital, attacking a hospital in this way, in this public way, is not only politically wrong, it is almost certainly, in fact, in my opinion, undoubtedly legally wrong as well. It's a completely inappropriate thing to do, morally, legally, politically, perhaps militarily. And of course, if the hospital is eventually captured, and if it is indeed cleared, and if Israel is unable to provide proof that this colossal bunker complex that it has been talking about actually exists, and it's important to say the hospital staff deny that it does exist, and so of course does Hamas. Well, of course, if it turns out that there is no great bunker complex there, then of course the political, legal and moral damage Israel will suffer as a result of this attack on the hospital will be much greater. It will be compounded multiple times. Now, I don't know what lies beneath the ground under the Al-Shifa hospital. I mean, I should say that straight away. I'm prepared to believe that Hamas does indeed have facilities under not just this hospital, but others, though, as I've said already, that would not, legally speaking, justify an attack on a hospital. And there are other ways of dealing with that. If Hamas, for example, is using hospitals as shields, then that is also illegal. That would also be a war crime. And there are agencies to whom that could be referred to, and those agencies could take action. And when I talk about agencies, I mean the Red Cross, I mean the International Criminal Court, I mean the Security Council. And as I've discussed in previous programs, in my opinion, one of the fundamental mistakes that has been made by the Israeli government, but much more by the United States government, was not to go to the Security Council right from the outset. And as we will see in a moment, it is increasingly clear now that the political machinery, the political, legal and enforcement machinery of the Security Council and of the United Nations and of the United Nations agencies is increasingly shifting towards a position where they are being used by Israel's and the United States' adversaries. But anyway, the point is, if this complex does not exist, this will be a political disaster. And I have to say, without myself knowing what is under the Al-Shifa hospital, it is difficult for me to understand why Hamas, which does not impress me as an unintelligent organization, to put it mildly, whatever else it is, it seems to me that the people who run Hamas are clever people. It hardly seems to me to make sense that they would conduct their entire operation from a single centralized headquarters located in one place, which Israel could destroy and attack, rendering their entire operation essentially broken. I would have thought that Hamas would do what insurgent and guerrilla and indeed terrorist groups invariably do, which is run their operation in a dispersed way, operate through multiple different cells, and if there is a central headquarters for Hamas, presumably they would operate it from a generally safe place, which would be outside the Gaza Strip entirely. Now, of course, I understand and I accept that there might be problems of political and military coordination if Hamas's headquarters were indeed located in some other country. I don't know which country. Say, and this is just, I'm plucking countries out of the air now. Qatar or Iran. I don't think it is in Iran as it happens. Or perhaps Sudan or somewhere else. Well, or Yemen or one of these places. Obviously there would be difficulties communicating with the fighters and the commanders in Gaza. But again, I would have thought that an organization like Hamas, knowing this in advance, would have taken steps long ago to secure its communications. And as I understand it, there are ways that some kind of communications would take place with, however, a great deal of latitude given to local commanders. So I am sceptical about these reports about this vast gun bunker complex. Of course, I may be wrong, but anyway, we will have to see. If Hamas is operating in this way, then it's obviously wrong to hide behind a hospital, but it would also be completely contrary to the classical way in which groups like Hamas operate. And I have to say, for the moment, I am deeply skeptical. Anyway, there is mounting pressure on Israel. There was an article in the Financial Times which basically confirmed as much. It said that Western governments are now putting increasing pressure on Israel to take action to reduce the number of civilians that have been killed in their operation in Gaza. This has provoked a defiant, in fact, I thought delusional speech from Prime Minister Netanyahu, in which he said that there would be no ceasefire, there would be no slackening of the military effort, and he spoke of Israel being prepared to conduct its operation even in defiance of the whole world. Now, I have to say, when a leader, a political leader of a country like Israel, remember, a small country, 10 million people, when a political leader starts talking in that kind of way, well, it sounds, frankly, at least to me, like something of an exercise in megalomania, but it also suggests the intensifying political pressure that Prime Minister Netanyahu is coming under behind the scenes. And in the latest, I noticed that in the latest political battles in Congress, House Speaker, the new Republican House Speaker, Mike Johnson, has suggested a package to the Biden administration in order to prevent the government, the US government, from closing down on the 18th of November. And I noticed that this proposed temporary package did not include funding for Ukraine. Well, that is unsurprising. Increasing numbers of Republicans are now insisting that there should be no further funding for Ukraine. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of the strongest voices on this, is becoming ever more outspoken about this. And I get the sense that she's gaining traction within the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives. But I notice also that Speaker Johnson's package also did not include a financial package for Israel, which I found surprising, but which I suspect reflects some opposition to this funding from left-wing Democrats in the House and even perhaps, though less so, in the Senate, where opposition to Israel is increasing. There were protests yesterday, not just in London, but outside President Biden's residence in Delaware, for example. And of course, it's, again, left-wing Democrats who will be leading these protests. And we've seen that the White House has been trying to get these two packages, for which there is majority support for each one, but strong opposition from the right and from the left in respect of either. It's been trying to get these two packages through by combining them together. It knows that if there is a standalone Ukrainian package, many House Republicans will vote against it, and some Republicans will vote against it in the Senate also, and that will obviously expose divisions within the Republican Party, but it will also open up the entire debate ahead of the election next year about aid for Ukraine. And of course it worries also that if there is a standalone package for aid to Israel, that will expose splits within the Democratic Party, with a certain number of House Democrats also voting against it, and this perhaps also opening up scope for debate about this issue in the election next year. So we could see the political problems that the stance of Prime Minister Netanyahu is now causing, even for Israel's friends in Washington, and friends in London, and friends in other places. And the fact that the stance that he's taking, the military operation that he is conducting, the way he is conducting this military operation in Gaza, is becoming problematic increasingly for Western governments, for Israel's allies, and of course is solidifying opposition across the world. Now, there may be some signs that there are some people in Israel who, within the Israeli political, military and intelligence leadership, who take a different view, think that this is not working out well. I read a post on Slavyangrad, which is a Russian Telegram channel. It covers the Ukrainian conflict extremely well. It's also been writing some very good and interesting pieces on the conflict in Gaza also, by the way. The Russians, and of course Slavyangrad is not just a Russian channel, but the Russians have been following the fighting in Gaza with a very keen, if you like, professional eye, now informed by their own experiences in the war in Ukraine. But anyway, I read a post there that there are rumors that there's a delegation, a group of Mossad officials are intending to meet with some political officials from Hamas itself in Cairo. Now, I don't know whether this is the case, and I have to say I've seen this only as an unsubstantiated single report in one place. If it is true, and it might be, contacts like this do happen in wars, then one does wonder indeed what that might be all about. And it might be a sign, as I said, that there are some people in the political and military establishment in Israel and the intelligence community who are starting to have doubts. However, I would say again, this is not a report I have been able to see corroborated from other sources, and we'll just have to see. I'm not sure where Slavyangrad got it, though, as I said, they're usually fairly careful to cross-check reports of this kind. Anyway, we'll see what happens. Now, there was yesterday a major summit of Arab and Muslim leaders in Riyadh. And yesterday I said that I wasn't sure exactly who would attend. Ebrahim Raisi and Bashar al-Assad and the Emir of Qatar were all there. Well, it turns out that this was a massive meeting. It brought together all the leaders of the Arab states. It brought together the leaders of the Organization for Islamic States. So it extended well beyond just the Arab states or the Middle Eastern states. They were all brought together in this one place. Erdogan, for example, of Turkey was also there and made a typically passionate speech. In fact, there were passionate speeches from many people. Mahmoud Abbas spoke, Ebrahim Raisi spoke, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, also spoke. In fact, he opened the conference. And a series of decisions were made. Now, can I just say that some of the more vivid things that some people were predicting and some people called for didn't happen. There were some proposals floated to, for example, for some kind of general oil and energy embargo. Saudi Arabia rejected that out of hand, as did the other Gulf producers. I have to say, I never thought that that would be a remotely viable option. And for the record, I think taking a step like that at this particular time would actually have been a mistake. It would have done severe damage to the European economy. It might have done significantly less damage to the United States economy, which is now largely self-sufficient in energy terms. But I can see how politically it might actually have consolidated support in the United States behind the administration and behind Israel, with many Americans thinking that the Muslim states were lining up with Hamas against the United States itself. And I think this would have been a mistake, and it wasn't done. And there were also proposals that airspace, Arab airspace, be closed to US military movements. Calls like that came principally, I understand, from Iran and its various allies in the region. Again, this was rejected by the Saudis and by the Gulf states. And for the record, again, I think this was a correct move. I don't think we are ready yet. We've reached that point in this crisis for steps like that to be taken. I think that if the Saudis were to announce something, if something like this were to happen now, I think that would create a major crisis between the United States and Saudi Arabia, and indeed, by the way, between the United States and Turkey and Qatar and all of these other countries. And I think that it's the sort of measure which, if you're going to take it, you don't want to take it early in a crisis, which we still are, by the way. We're still relatively early in this crisis. You want to save it to use much later when the crisis is closer to some kind of boiling point. Anyway, those ideas were rejected. And of course, it's these rejections which people, to the extent that they're covering this conference at all, I noticed, by the way, that the media in Britain has hardly a word to say about this particular conference. Anyway, the fact that these conferences, these proposals were rejected tends to be what has attracted the most attention. And this is a mistake because the conference did take some very important decisions which are exactly in line with what I have been saying, what I've been expecting the Arab states, the leading Arab states, the Muslim states to do right from the point where the crisis began. The first is that these two organizations that conducted this conference together, the Arab League and this Islamic grouping, they have agreed that they would work together, and they have established a joint working party to coordinate together further steps moving forward with what they're going to do. And they continuously spoke throughout the statement that was published, about the United Nations, about the Security Council. They referenced the fact that the General Assembly resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire has not been implemented. And you can see again that this joint committee, which from what I can understand will be largely chaired by the Saudis, though there will be other representatives there also, they're going to be working for further steps to be taken in the United Nations. And I've been saying all along that this is where the focal point of the pressure is going to be. The joint statement made strong comments about the fact that the Security Council up to now has taken no action, that, as I said, the General Assembly resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire has not been implemented. They make demands for the Security Council to act, and it seems to me it is now a virtual certainty that we will be seeing more resolutions being placed before the Security Council and ultimately the General Assembly as well. But they will not this time be backed simply by the Arab states. They will be backed by the entire Muslim world, and of course increasingly global South countries will also be drawn in and will become involved as well. So that is one thing. The other thing that is happening, and which again I found very interesting coming out of this joint statement, and which is again exactly consistent with what I expected, is increasing pressure set out in the joint statement for action to be taken by the International Criminal Court. And there was even one provision, further provision in the joint statement, criticising double standards. The fact that the Western powers, and by implication the International Criminal Court, apply one set of criteria against countries that the United States is opposed to, and everybody knows that this is a reference to the arrest warrant and indictment of President Putin, and another set of standards to countries that the West supports, which is of course ultimately Israel in this particular case. And there is increasing amount of pressure from not just the Arab but the Muslim world now on the ICC to take some kind of step. And I discussed yesterday this incredibly defensive speech that Karim Khan, the chief prosecutor of the ICC, made in Cairo. But you can see that the pressure is growing on the ICC to take some sort of step. And can I just say that if the ICC does decide to issue indictments or warrants against Israeli officials, which it might do, the joint statement issued from this summit did exactly, again, what I anticipated they would do. They focused on these extraordinary statements made by a variety of Israeli officials. I have repeatedly said that these comments by Israeli officials have the potential to become evidence in a future prosecution, and the summit meeting in Riyadh, exactly in that context, focused on that particular point. But if the ICC and does decide to issue indictments and warrants, either on its own initiative, disregarding the ultra vires principles in the Rome Statute, if it does issue indictments and arrest warrants against Israeli officials, that will be a disaster. And if it happens, of course, following a referral to the ICC by the General Assembly, that would be an even bigger disaster. And it seems to me that we are now clearly heading in that direction. Can I just say there's been more resolutions with the General Assembly over the last couple of days. One, for example, criticising the imposition by the West of unilateral sanctions. And they have been carried by big majorities. And it does seem to me that there is now a solidifying two-thirds majority within the General Assembly, which might conceivably, in fact, might quite plausibly, make a referral to the ICC. Now, if the ICC issues indictments and warrants against Israeli officials, that will be an absolute disaster for the Western powers, given the enormous pressure which they successfully brought against the ICC to issue arrest warrants and indictments against President Putin on a far more, I would say, frankly, misconceived charge, despite the fact that Russia is not a member of does not ratify the Rome Statute, and despite the fact that there has been no referral from the Security Council or indeed the General Assembly. If this happens, how does the West object? What does the West say in response to such an act by the ICC? And this is not to be underestimated. The effect of this is not to be underestimated. Some of these extraordinary comments, these terrible comments, the Amalek comment, for example, have been made by Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. Other comments, even more disastrous comments, have been made by other senior Israeli officials and indeed government ministers. The Western powers have been making it very clear to all countries that have ratified the Rome Statute that they are under a legal obligation, if President Putin arrives in their countries, to arrest him. How do they then disregard arrest warrants issued against top Israeli officials if they also arrive in those Western countries, practically all of them, bar the United States, which have also ratified the Rome Statute? They will be faced with a situation where they either undermine the ICC or comply with its terms, something, of course, which they do not want under any circumstances to do. Now, the ICC itself obviously does not want to find itself in this kind of situation. But it is facing, as I said, what is now increasingly looking like overwhelming pressure. And it runs the risk of becoming comprehensively discredited across the world, outside the West. And there is, of course, also a real danger, which must concern people in the ICC, that if it does not, in fact, take action, then countries around the world might start to pull out of the Rome Statute, in which case the ICC could find itself reduced to a rump. So, we're not there yet. We're starting to head in that direction. There was more coming out from this summit meeting than even that. The next thing that they discussed is that they want an international peace conference. Now, this is a proposal which, to my knowledge, was first floated by the Chinese, and the Muslim states are now backing it. The statement reads as follows: call for convening an international peace conference as soon as possible, through which a credible peace process will be launched based on international law, legitimate resolutions, and the principle of land for peace within a defined time frame and international guarantees, ultimately leading to the end of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories since 1967, including East Jerusalem, the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, the Sheba Farms, the Kfar Shuba Hills, and the outskirts of the Lebanese village of Al-Mari, and the implementation of a two-state solution. In other words, working towards achieving the objective outlined by President Putin and by the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, taking control of the mediation process out of the hands of the United States, the whole mediation process in the Middle East, the process intended to achieve Middle East peace, taking it out of the hands of the United States and transferring it to this international peace conference. In other words, directly challenging the US's long-established primacy in peace negotiations in the Middle East. And I suspect that this will be something which, amongst State Department officials, people who know the Middle East, this is going to be perhaps the most concerning thing of all. Because again, if there is a General Assembly resolution to this effect, especially if it is passed under conceivably the Uniting for Peace formula, and there might be a majority in the General Assembly for that, how does the United States object to it? On what basis does the United States object to an international peace conference? One which, however, were it ever convened, would reduce the role of the United States in conducting peace negotiations in the Middle East. And note that this resolution tells us what the end point is going to be. It says that there should be two-state solution, one in which the Palestinians have their own state, based on the one in which also Israel itself is reduced to its 1967 borders. Israel would retain its capital in West Jerusalem. That, I think, is widely agreed. But of course, the Palestinians, their capital would be in East Jerusalem. That would be a very difficult thing for Israel to agree to. And of course, Israel would also be expected to disgorge control of the Golan Heights and other territories that it also controls and which are claimed by other Arab states, specifically Syria and Lebanon. So I'm not saying that this is actually the exact outcome that we would see, but This is the terminus point that the Arab and Muslim states, along with the BRIC states, are increasingly talking about. And lastly, there is a discussion as to who would represent the Palestinians in the event that there was such an international peace conference. And the meeting, the summit meeting, once more referenced historic resolutions which recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. Palestinian Liberation Organization is dominated, obviously, has historically been dominated by Fatah, which is the group behind the Palestinian Authority. It is the group to which Mahmoud Abbas belongs. And in effect, Hamas is being told to rejoin the PLO or to join the PLO, something which in the past they have not wanted to do. Anyway, these are the demands, these are the things that this summit meeting has come up with. Now, let me come back again to what I said. The key to understand this is that the focus of diplomatic activity is going to move back to the United Nations. The UN Secretariat, its various agencies are now solidly lining up behind all of these proposals from the Arab and Muslim states and from the BRIC states. Remember, Saudi Arabia and Iran are going to become BRIC states themselves before very long. And the objective that is now being set is to put pressure on the ICC to take action. And we can see that the ICC is indeed coming under immense pressure. And we saw this speech, this very defensive speech that Karim Khan made in Cairo, and to convene an international peace conference, setting up a clear set of eventual objectives, and, by the way, a timeline within a defined timeline and with international guarantees, leading eventually to the two-state solution. Now, there are many people who say, and they may very well be right, that the two-state solution is now impractical. It cannot be achieved, that there is no realistic way any longer of negotiating a two-state solution. And that may very well be true. But for the moment, this is the issue, that this is the objective that most of the world is focusing upon. If negotiations do start, and they start from a position where Israel and the United States are pushed onto the back foot, well, then we might start to see things develop in a different way. But for the moment, because as this joint statement from this summit said, a two-state solution is the basis established in existing international law and legitimate resolutions of the UN Security Council. Well, given that that is so, it is the starting point for a peace process, the outcome of which might ultimately be different, but which might be taken out of the hands of the West and Israel and the United States. Now, as I said, we will see how things develop, but further draft resolutions presented to the General Assembly and to the UN Security Council are now inevitably going to come. And we see that the Muslim states, led by the Saudis, and in effect the Iranians also, are now starting to set out their clear goals for what these resolutions should work towards. They will have the backing of the Chinese and the Russians. They will have the backing of most of the world. And all of this is taking place even as there is growing revulsion in Western countries, including Britain and the United States, against the conduct, the Israeli conduct, of the military operation in Gaza. And all of this is happening against the background of a political crisis in the United States, a budgetary crisis in which quite plausibly the US government might start to find itself short of money after the 18th of November, and an election next year in which the grassroots of the Democratic Party are becoming increasingly disaffected. So, accumulating pressure, and it's unsurprising, therefore, that we see these articles appearing in the Financial Times about the growing pressure from Western governments on Israel, and that we also see how this pressure is starting to elicit from Prime Minister Netanyahu these extraordinary comments about Israel battling on against the whole world, if that is what it comes to. I would just conclude these comments about this crisis in the Middle East by saying that, of course, if Israel does capture the Al-Shifa hospital, if there are huge casualties over the course of that happening, if they then discover that the bunker complex beneath the Al-Shifa hospital that they told the world about either doesn't exist or is on a far smaller scale than they have led the world to believe, well, obviously the revulsion will be greater and the pressure will grow. So that's where we are today as a result of these latest moves. The fighting in Gaza taking an ominous turn, and we can see how the diplomatic pieces are moving. Well, there is, of course, another crisis, and that crisis is the one in Ukraine. And, of course, it is very difficult for the Western powers that they find themselves confronted with these two crises at one and the same time, especially given the budget crisis in the United States. And that budget crisis is now starting to take its toll. And it's important to say that the major reason that there is a budget crisis in the United States is not because the United States has been supplying funding and weapons to Ukraine. In terms of the funding, that is small change relative to the size of the overall US budget. The reason that there is a budgetary crisis in the United States is because the Biden administration has been trying to keep the US economy humming along, growing fast by a massive spending program, which is causing the US budget deficit to widen. And this is starting to cause increasing concern, and it is also becoming a political target for the president's Republican opponents. And I understand that two credit rating agencies, I believe they're Moody's and Fitch, have now downgraded the US credit rating as the prospect of a government shutdown starting from the 18th of November begins to loom. So these problems in the United States, they're intractable, but they are to a great extent on the part of the administration, self-inflicted. They've sought to keep activity in the US economy high, but they have taken increasing risks on the fiscal side. That has kept interest rates in the United States high, and it has made increased concerns about the overall sustainability, both of the kind of growth that the administration has been engineering, but also about the long-term fiscal position of the United States. Anyway, let's turn now to the situation in Ukraine, and we're now getting news pouring in of further military activity. Now, let me say again, it's not always easy to get an exact, detailed view of what is happening in each particular battle zone. Let me say again, if you want to get a blow-by-blow account of what is happening in particular battlefields in the Ukraine conflict, in my opinion, the best place to go is the Slavyangrad Telegram channel. It is straightforwardly and openly pro-Russian. It makes a big effort to be reliable and accurate. It provides extremely interesting and intelligent commentary about the direction of the battles, and it also acts as a very effective site aggregator, bringing together reports from all kinds of both Russian and Ukrainian telegram channels, certainly the best and more reliable ones, which, when you put them all together, do give you an overall picture of what is actually going on. And it's clear that Ukraine is facing a severely deteriorating military picture. Now, the focus, of course, remains Avdeyevka, and Dima at the Military Summary channel yesterday, in my opinion, provided a very, very interesting and very detailed account of what is going on in Avdeyevka, and you can also, as I said, see the discussions at Slavyangrad. But the long and the short of it is that the Russians are continuing their advances. They're pushing beyond the railway line in the west of Avdeyevka. They're assembling very large forces around Avdeyevka. Some reports suggest that there are up to 40,000 Russian troops in the area. Others even claim that there are more than that. The Russians are pushing hard beyond the railway. They have, it seems it's now largely acknowledged, or universally acknowledged, except, interestingly, by the Russian Defense Ministry, which is virtually silent about all of these things. Anyway, it is now acknowledged that the Russians have indeed managed to enter the village of Stepnoye, and that there's bitter fighting going on for control of this village. Beyond Stepnoye is Berdichi. If Berdichi is captured, then the access routes into Avdeyevka for the Ukrainians become extremely problematic. And there are also reports this time from Ukrainian channels which also appear to confirm that there is intense Russian pressure on the coke factory, that the Russians are making more and more efforts to break into the coke factory, or if not, perhaps to break into the coke factory, to keep the Ukrainians pinned down there. And there's also more reports which I don't find entirely easy to follow myself. There are lots of place names which seem to change. There's a kaleidoscope of different names for what are sometimes the same places. The Russians have a name for a village, and the Ukrainians have a different name for a village, and sometimes there's more names for particular villages even than that. But anyway, there is a lot of reports that the Russians are also pushing forward hard from the south, and that the pincers around Avdeyevka continue to close, and that the shelling and fighting around Avdeyevka remains at extremely high levels of intensity. And alongside that, there are also now reports, there were reports this morning about a major Russian offensive in the Vremivka salient area, that the Russians have been launching probing advances in the Vremivka salient area for some time. They found that most of the Ukrainian troops that were located there, the place, the Vremivka salient being of course the place where Ukraine's offensive on the 4th of June began. The actual fighting started there, not further west in the Rabotino, Orechov, Verbovoye area. But anyway, there's now more reports that the Russians have launched a major attack in the Vremivka salient area. They've discovered that most of the Ukrainian troops that were formerly there have had to be reassigned to other places to try to defend Avdeyevka, and of course the 4 Marine brigades have been relocated all the way west to Kherson region. We will come to those in a moment. But anyway, there's more reports of a major Russian advance, this time possibly intended to bring back Staromayorsk and Orozhenie, those 2 villages that the Ukrainians captured after such bitter fighting back in August, to bring those 2 villages back under Russian control, and ultimately, or so it seems to me, to try to erase entirely Ukrainian gains in the Vremivka salient, all of the gains that the Ukrainians achieved over the course of their offensive. And even as that is going on, there are more reports about further Russian advances from Bakhmut. Now, I said that Slavyangrad is a place to go for accurate reporting, and both they and Dima at the Military Summary channel, I've noticed, by the way, that recently Slavyangrad and the Military Summary channel have been establishing what looks like a close and friendly and very productive partnership with each other. Anyway, they've both confirmed that those earlier reports, which I was citing in earlier programs, that Klishevka, that the Ukrainians had been entirely driven out of this village of Klishevka, southwest of Bakhmut, which they've been straining to capture. They've been straining to capture, well, basically since they started their attacks in the Bakhmut area on the 10th of May. Anyway, that there are still Ukrainian troops in Klishevka, and it does seem as if fighting for this particular village, this ruined village of, I understand, 500 people before the war. Anyway, that this fighting continues to take place there. But it is generally acknowledged, again, that the Russians have now pushed the Ukrainians back from the railway, which had become the major front line in this area. The Ukrainians have failed to break through, to cut off Russian road links from the southeast into Bakhmut, and it does seem as if the Russians are pushing hard in the Klishevka, Andreevka area. Though the Ukrainians, their forces depleted though they are continuing to resist there. And there's also reports that the Russians have managed now to consolidate positions in Berkhovka, which is the Berkhovka reservoir area, and near the village of Berkhovka, north of Bakhmut, and that they do seem altogether to be tightening their grip on Bakhmut and in the areas around it. Now, I read one report, probably it was on Slavyangrad, difficult to keep track of things now, but it came from a Ukrainian source, and they're starting to get increasingly panicky, also it seems to me, about the situation in Bakhmut. And they're talking about how the Russians clearly have not given up on their long-term objective, once they consolidate control of Bakhmut, to press on towards Chasov Yar and beyond that to Konstantinovka, or the other places to the west of Chasov Yar, and gradually to start to move towards Kramatorsk to the west. So, difficult situation for the Ukrainians in Bakhmut. And further north, again, lots of reports about the Russians steadily, incrementally closing in on Ukrainian forces around Kupiansk, though there's been less information about the fighting there. Though again, one does get the reports of the Ukrainians continuing to suffer casualties in that area. So a major operational crisis for Ukraine in Avdeyevka, with the Ukrainians stripping much of their front line of troops to try to redeploy their forces to try to hold on in Avdeyevka. The 47th Brigade, the one with the Bradleys and the Leopard 2s, has been redeployed from the Rabotino-Verbovoye area to try and hold the line at Avdeyevka. This is a tragic brigade. It has been massively battered in repeated battles on the Zaporozhye front. Its forces have become very run down. It was at one point pulled back for some kind of reconstitution, and long before one suspects that has been completed, it's had to be thrown back into battle to try to hold back the Russian advance on Avdeyevka. And other troops from Bakhmut, from the Vremivka salient area, they're all having to be redeployed to hold the line at Avdeyevka as well. And my impression is, by the way, that the Ukrainians are indeed managing to slow Russian advances in Avdeyevka by deploying all of these troops from all of these other places. But disastrously for them, they're not managing to prevent those Russian advances entirely. On the contrary, the Russians continue to make steady, incremental progress despite this Ukrainian resistance. And in the meantime, what is happening is that the Ukrainians are obliged to weaken their front lines in every other place, allowing the Russians to increase the pressure. And we see that in Bakhmut, we see that in the Vremivka salient as well. And I get the sense that the Russians are doing the same thing. In Kupiansk, they're steadily, incrementally increasing the pressure around Kupiansk and Liman. Again, the Ukrainians are having to rush troops to try to hold the line in these places, pull whatever remaining forces they have out of their reserves, trying to slow the Russian advance or stop the Russian advance. They can slow the advance, but they cannot stop it, and they're taking very, very heavy losses by doing so. And they're also suffering very heavy losses in two other places. The one is that place where they were able to carve out the salient in the grey zone, the area of the, if you like, the zone of control north of the Surovikin line. This is Rabotino-Verbovoye. There's still Ukrainian troops fighting in these places, trying to hold their positions between these two villages and the salient that they've carved out between these two villages, Rabotino and Verbovoye. The result, of course, inevitably, is that they find themselves in what is in effect a fire sack. They're surrounded by the Russians, by the Russian artillery on the higher ground on three sides, and they take increasing losses there. And of course, they also have to parry Russian counterattacks in this salient, which take place now on a regular basis. And I'm going to suggest that this is exactly the same pattern that we're seeing in Kherson region. There's been Ukrainian forces, as we see, have been trying to establish themselves on the east bank of the Dnieper. The only place where, as far as I can see, they've established any kind of presence so far is Kirki, this small village close to the on the banks of the Dnieper. But they continue to try to establish themselves in other places to broaden their bridgehead. There is now accumulating evidence that these attempts to do this are causing those 4 Marine brigades that they have relocated to Kherson region from the Vremivka salient, 4 Marine brigades which had suffered very heavy losses in the fighting in the Vremivka salient and will have only been partially reconstituted, that these 4 Marine brigades are again suffering very, very heavy losses, carving out what is again essentially a salient in the zone of control west of the major Russian fortified lines in this area, which is some distance from the banks of the Dnieper. And there was even a report I saw yesterday on the Military Summary channel which spoke of a video which showed bodies of Ukrainian soldiers lying on the ground in this area, severely hit and killed. And again, on the Military Summary channel, Dima again did beg the question, what is this all ultimately for? Because there is no realistic way that the Ukrainians, with 4 depleted brigades, perhaps 16,000 men, are going to be able to break through the heavy Russian defences in this area. They're carving out a salient, which is simply causing them more losses. And of course, this plays directly into Russian objectives. The Russians are inflicting ever greater attrition on the Ukrainians every day and all the time. They're doing it in Kherson region, in Avdeyevka, in the Vremivka salient, in Bakhmut, in Kupiansk, even as their own forces are increasing in scale all the time. And in Avdeyevka, as I said before, one can talk about an operational crisis which risks unhinging the entire Ukrainian defense system in the southern Donbass as well. So, very critical situation for Ukraine. US funding drying up, supplies of weapons from the United States drying up, admissions from the European Union that they can't supply Ukraine with all the shells that they promised Ukraine. The German government, the only government as far as I can see, which continues to double down, it's going to try and double its military funding for Ukraine. But the reality is that Germany itself has largely run out of weapons, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and guns and ammunitions that it can send to Ukraine. An increasingly bleak picture. And there are more and more reports of dissension. There's a report by Mark Galliotti in the London Times today who talks about dissension between the Ukrainian intelligence services and the Western intelligence services. Western intelligence services unhappy about this campaign of assassinations that Ukraine has been trying to conduct or conducting within Russia and in Russian-controlled areas. By the way, I've noticed that this drone offensive that the Ukrainians were at one time launching against Moscow seems now to have entirely petered out, suggesting that the Ukrainians have run out of resources to continue to conduct it. Anyway, reports about that, more reports about questions about President Zelensky's own position. Apparently, again, there's been suggestions that an aide to President Kuchma has spoken about President Zelensky being the major obstacle to peace talks. There's talk about people looking for ways to remove President Zelensky from his position so that peace talks can begin. I'm going to finish this program with one observation here. I definitely think that in Ukraine's own interests, peace talks are now absolutely essential. It's also absolutely clear to me that President Zelensky himself is in no position to open negotiations with the Russians. Doing that would put his position in Ukraine and perhaps even his life in serious jeopardy, and he's not going to do that. But trying to organize peace talks on the subject of Ukraine, trying to end the war in Ukraine, whilst engineering President Zelensky's removal, are fraught, it seems to me, with colossal risks. If there is some kind of regime change operation in Kiev, however it's done, even if it's done in a constitutional and legal way, in which President Zelensky is removed from office and replaced with someone else, say General Zelensky, or perhaps former President Kuchma, or someone like that, who might be prepared to step in and conduct negotiations. And if this new leader, whoever he was able to consolidate his position in Kiev, which is far from certain, there might be intense opposition to this leader from the more hardline nationalist forces in Ukraine, and it's not clear that this person would be able to consolidate his control. But let's say this person did consolidate his control and contacted the Russians and said that Ukraine is ready to begin talks. What would the Russians say? The Russians would almost certainly still reject outright any suggestion of a ceasefire. When there were the talks in February and March last year, the Russians announced a one-day ceasefire the day after the special military operation began, at which point the Ukrainian delegation failed to turn up. And it's well known that President Putin, who ordered that ceasefire, came under severe criticism from his military chiefs for having taken that step. And then a few weeks later, when it looked as if there'd been a diplomatic breakthrough in Istanbul, the Russians pulled their forces back from near Kiev, supposedly because the Ukrainians asked them to. That's what the Russians say. And on the basis that an agreement to end the war was now in sight. But then, of course, the Ukrainians went back on what had been agreed, following urgings to do so from the United States and from Britain. And the Russians, ever since, have again complained that they were tricked. So how do the Ukrainians manage to persuade the Russians that this time, if there is a ceasefire, they will stick by it, that they won't use it to their own advantage? The Russians have repeatedly said that they will not agree to a ceasefire, and I think on this one we must take them at their word. So a Ukrainian president would be broaching with the Russians a proposal for negotiations on some kind of terms which would be open to discussion, but which would surely require Ukraine to give up the regions that the Russians control, the 4 regions. Probably the Russians would certainly, at the very least, insist for control of all of the 4 regions. And by the way, the former NATO Secretary General, Anders Fogh Rasmussen, an extremely hardline figure, by the way, is now saying that in order for Ukraine to enter NATO, it needs to be prepared to give up the 4 regions. A delusional comment, by the way, because the Russians have already made it clear that as far as they're concerned, a cast iron commitment from Ukraine and from the Western powers that Ukraine will not be joining NATO is an absolute precondition for a peace settlement. But anyway, never mind. Let's say that a new Ukrainian president comes along, tells the Russians, I want to talk peace, I'm prepared to give up the 4 regions, I'm prepared to give up Crimea, I'm prepared to negotiate about NATO membership. And the Russians say, well, yes, let's sit down and talk about all of those things, but we're not going to agree to a ceasefire. Then, of course, the immediate question that Ukrainian soldiers on the battlefronts, many of whom are showing increasing signs of disillusionment and demoralization and exhaustion, are going to be asking is that if the Ukrainian government is prepared to negotiate away all of these things, why are they still fighting? What are they risking their lives for? And it's not difficult to see how in those conditions resistance might simply collapse. There's been reports for many weeks now that large numbers of Ukrainian soldiers are surrendering to the Russians. There's been film appearing of Ukrainian soldiers. I discussed one recently about soldiers defending Avdeyevka, making programs, publishing videos, complaining about the political and military leadership in Ukraine. There's also increasing numbers of protests in Ukraine itself about the actions of President Zelensky and his government. There's lots of signs of gathering exhaustion and demoralization. The word goes out that that Ukraine is now negotiating peace terms with the Russians that are going to give away everything that Ukrainian soldiers have been asked to fight for the last 2 years. One can very easily see why soldiers might say to themselves, well, what is the point? Why should we go on fighting? Why should we be the last to die in what is increasingly becoming a lost war? There could be a collapse in morale, a collapse in resistance. Soldiers and officers might start to melt away. And that process might extend to the rest of Ukraine also. It's not difficult to see how something like that might indeed happen. So I think this is an extremely difficult thing to pull off. And I think this whole idea of engineering regime change, shuffling out President Zelensky and start getting the Ukrainians to start negotiations in this way is, in my opinion, a complete non-starter. I think if there are going to be negotiations, then the United States needs to accept that it has to be the interlocutor with the Russians. The point now would not be to win the war. It would be presumably to avoid a total collapse in Ukraine and to at least save something from the wreckage. If not the greater Ukrainian project, at least some remnant of America's face. Now, I don't get the impression that the Biden administration is ready to do anything like that. I don't get the impression that anybody in the EU is prepared to do anything like that. They're still stuck on this formula, nothing without Ukraine. The Ukrainians supposedly have to be involved in every stage of the negotiations. And though the United States has made similar commitments in previous wars, in South Vietnam, in Afghanistan, for example, and has eventually resigned from them and spoken directly to the other side, I think that the political timetable in which that can happen this time is too short for this to become effective. So, negotiations remain, in my opinion, still something of a mirage, and in the meantime, the Russian pressure on the front line just goes on increasing. Well, that's my programme for today. More from me soon. Let me wish you all again a very good day. Let me remind you that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work but via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop where you can find all the amazing things we have there. Magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all of those things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Until then.